Hi everyone, my name is Rafael Posada. I'm a fourth year Justice, Political Philosophy and Law student, in short, for JPPL. I'm taking a Philosophy of Feminist course, and we're discussing the topic intersectionality. For people who don't know what intersectionality is a social feminist theory that discusses how different oppressions interact with each other. People who face intersectional discrimination is anyone who identified with different social and biological and cultural groups, and the idea of this project is to interview different people on campus that have leadership positions that may face intersectional discrimination. Thank you. So the first question is, please tell us about yourself and how do you identify?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so my name is Saruja. I'm the current Vice President and Administration of the McMaster Students Union. So just a little bit about, what I do and what I did before I became a VP admin. On the daily, I manage all of the part-time managers that operate the student services that we run through our student union. So that can span from anything from emergency first response to some of our peer support services and including our identity-based peer support services, to food security services, to leadership services that we have. So before that, I served a year on the Student Representative Assembly as an SRA Science member. And then before that, I was extensively involved with a club on campus, McMaster Relay for Life. I was the co-president, and I was involved with a lot of the MSU services that we have here on a volunteer and an executive level. I would say how I identify myself as is I would say a South Asian woman of color.
So my name is Sabrine. I'm in my second year of psychology, neuroscience, and behavior. That sounds very pretentious. Not really. A little bit. I have a twin sister. I'm originally from Vaughan, Ontario, which is where Canada's Wonderland is. That's how people remember it. I live off campus. I am a very avid musician. I'm listing things out. I'm a very avid musician. I play the flute, the guitar, the tenor saxophone, and the piano. Yeah, that's about it. I'm trying to think of who I am as a person, but in terms of the identities, so I am the identities I associate with, I guess, are I am a woman, specifically a woman of color. I am also identified as a Muslim, as you can see, and I think those are kind of I guess there's a lot of intersections, but those are kind of my main intersections.
Perfect.
My name is Jamie. I'm a multimedia and theater student in my third year. Identify as a black person. I'm non-binary. I'm queer. I'm an immigrant. I was born in South Africa, but I'm Congolese. But I was born in South Africa and my family moved around a lot, so I lived in the States for a while, and then I moved here maybe 7 years ago, 2010. Among other things, I am a survivor of sexual assault, which is an experience it's important to me to mention when I talk about ways that I identify, and an artist.
So I would say I identify as first of all, a woman, very importantly. I think that's sort of the most important thing in my life. Having strong female role models growing up and coming from a culture that not oppresses, but sort of doesn't give voice to women sometimes. Not necessarily stemming from hatred or disrespect for women, but that's just the way things have been. So I think that's really important, being a strong woman. I also identify as an Indian Canadian. So I wouldn't say I'm just Indian, just because I've been in Canada for the better half of my life and I came here for a reason. I love Canada, so I think that's very important to my identity as well. But I also do love my Indian heritage. I love festivals we have, I love my culture, and I love all the stories and the cultural traditions that my parents have passed on in my family. And finally, in terms of my sexuality, I don't really like labels, but I guess the category I would best fit into is bisexual. So it's never really been, I guess because my parents would never put any pressure on me in terms of that, it's just something that never usually comes up in conversation. So I've never had to talk about it, and being someone who has a boyfriend, people just assume you're straight. So no questions are really asked. So it's not something that comes up often, but when it does, it's something I'm not afraid to say.
There's a need for safe and inclusive spaces in general, and what safe spaces are you affiliated on campus that you can?
I would say that there's definitely a need for safe and inclusive spaces on campus. One, I think these spaces exist so you can go and identify yourself with other individuals that hold that identity and who go through those experiences. So whether it's validation for some of the experiences that you have felt on campus, whether it's you collectively work together to advance a platform or an idea like gender equity, or advocating for trans rights, or advocating for marginalized identities on campus. They provide these spaces and opportunities for you to develop programming to encourage campus to move towards a social movement or a social change as a collective. But like I said, I think one of the biggest things that these safe spaces establish on campus is having a space where you can go and you feel that your identity is not a barrier in you engaging with dialogue, or you connecting with students, or you being able to just find a place where your experience is validated on this campus. And I think that is the number one reason why I think safe spaces and inclusive spaces do play a very important role on campus. In terms of, I would say, the safe spaces that I'm affiliated with, I would say the Women and Gender Equity Network is definitely a safe space on campus that I identify with. I would say, again, diversity services, they don't really have a space on campus, but they have, I would say, a virtual space where they create opportunities for, or they develop programming for us to think critically about different groups on campus and the experiences that they face. With respect to the identity-based spaces on campus, I do think they play an important role, like McMaster and QCC. Unfortunately, I don't identify specifically with those spaces, but I would say the Women and Gender Equity Network is something that I definitely affiliate with on campus.
Definitely mention that.
Sure. So I can tell you that the safe spaces that I identify with on campus. So specifically, I identify with WGEN, the Women and Gender Equity Network. I also identify, diversity services is they just have not necessarily a space for it, but they do provide events and stuff that do provide safe spaces in that sense. Those are kind of the main kind of advocacy services that I do identify with. In terms of the need for safe spaces on campus, I think they're very important. I think that in the sense that you should be able to have a space in which you feel comfortable being who you are as a person, and also kind of in a way it provides you with this medium to talk about issues that kind of you face as an individual, and kind of look at these commonalities between you and other people who identify in the same intersection in that sense. But yeah, so I do definitely think that safe spaces are important, and I think that they also provide us with this need to talk about things and look at equity and things like that.
Perfect. Is there what specific safe spaces are you affiliated with on campus?
Okay, yeah. So I am affiliated with WGEN, so the Women Gender Equity Network, and I also attend a lot of the MSU Diversity Services events.
Perfect.
I am a large involved in a large part of the different communities and stuff. But whether I consider them to be safe spaces, I guess it depends.
Well,
But, yeah.
safe spaces could also be clubs, specific clubs. You mentioned that you were part of the Science Society.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you feel there when you're
I do feel depending on what I'm involved with, I do feel comfortable, and I think that my comfort comes in the fact of whether they're promoting an inclusive environment, in the sense that on campus you don't really see many people who look like me, I guess, being involved. So it's good and stuff, but whether I feel comfortable, maybe not always. For example, my sister actually repped the science community, and she was one of 2 women who wore the headscarf It was 2 or 3, I don't remember. But yeah, 1 or 2 women, and like I guess like everybody, like the events that they kind of promote and the ideas that they kind of value are a little bit deviant from kind of like what I value as an individual or what my sister would value as an individual. So sometimes I guess like there was like that clash there and like feeling uncomfortable in that sense. But like within like working like myself as like within the Life Sciences Society, I've always felt like comfortable being who I am as a person. So like not in that sense, but I think it like kind of just depends on the environment that's like being encouraged, or the environment or the space that's being like
Perfect. A couple. And where do you feel more represented, and when you feel less represented in the ones that you're part of?
I'm a CA on campus, so I am involved with RLS, Resident Life. And last year I was a volunteer with Jen. I'm also in like the theater program, and I consider that to be one of my safe spaces on campus. I was like briefly like involved with the QSCC, but I stopped going there. I don't think I feel represented in any spaces. I feel like I only ever feel partially represented. Like there are only parts of myself that are like open for discussion in each of these spaces. Even like the really good ones. In Resident Life, I had some unfriendly interactions with management when I was having issues related to like mental health, and I think that they often talk about themselves as being a safe space, and they try to provide training on like mental health and like how you can support your students, and also tell you to self-care and stuff like that. But the way that they have set up their organization, even like the training days, doesn't allow for a lot of that to happen. It feels like a lot of just like trying to use buzzwords.
And you mentioned that some of the safe spaces that you're part of, they're very good, right? And which of them do you think you consider that they're really good at helping you feel more represented, even though you're not represented necessarily in all of them, and if all part of your identities, but what are they doing that is better, that may help improve other safe spaces that you're part of, right?
I think Gem is a good space. Like it's one of the better ones. I know that they operate with like an intersectional feminist like framework, and I, being involved with them last year and watching them this year, you know that they are very much open to criticism and open to changing the way they operate or changing the language that they use. That being said, there are a lot of like flaws in the way that they currently operate, or in the way that they've like handled the situation, or even just the way that their space.
What do you think are those flaws necessarily, like in your experience?
Some of them are just like really petty, but like also important to different people. Like some of it's in language, like as with Jen, I don't know the exact wording, but it's like they are very much there for women identified and trans people, but the use of like saying like woman identified kind of it's like the idea of like cisgendered people get to be like the actual gender, and then everybody else is just like a step away, like a step removed. Like you are not a woman, you're woman identified. You're not a man, you identify as a man. Like you don't have pronouns, you have preferred pronouns, right? Which is kind of like offensive and harmful to some people, right? And like it's kind of like subtly like invalidating, right? Also, with the way the space runs, just being in the space last year, and I haven't been in it this year, so I don't know how it's changed. but like I know that anytime like a man will enter the space, the energy shifts, which is bad for a lot of different reasons. It's bad for like, first of all, like assuming someone's gender when they enter a space, right? Which could already be like a vulnerable thing if people are like hostile, like that's like a trans person, right? Like what does that do? If someone's like in crisis and they're like a survivor of sexual assault, which to me is really important because the majority of the people that I connect with and who I know are survivors are men, right? So like those are just like the two situations that I just like really hope don't happen. Like I hope that no one says something and it's not neither of those two people who are like entering the space, it's just some like random. But there are also issues with and it's not even the exact sense, sometimes just people in the space, and I guess it's more of like workshops and like kind of stuff like that. But there was an interaction where two religious girls came into the space and they were talking about a club that they had, and the space got immediately hostile, and as soon as they left, people were like making fun of them. And it's like, I'm looking around as like a volunteer, and I know this girl who's in our space right now is like very religious, right? And she's a feminist and she's queer, right? And this other girl is like a different religion, but she's also religious, right? And it's like, those are issues, like the idea that you can't be both is also, I think, something that needs to be like explored, and I know that they had workshops on that this year.
Do you have any?
With respect to like specific safe spaces, like like the Women in Gender Equity Network, I wouldn't necessarily say that I had to like compromise like part of my identity to be a part of the space. I do feel very well represented there, and I think, like I said, a part of that is that part of these spaces exist to like validate the experiences that you have on campus. So when I walk into these spaces, I see people like me, I can talk about the experiences, and I can hear that other people have similar experiences. I feel like there's a space where we can obviously like drive a social movement or a social change through the collective, through the people there that want to, I guess, strive towards the same thing that you want to strive towards. If you're looking at the concept of like campus as a whole being a safe space, and because that's essentially what these smaller safe spaces are trying to establish, is like the larger safe space of how can we create safe spaces for individuals regardless of their race, their gender, their ethnic backgrounds. I think when we're talking about that, it does become a challenge because like some of the experiences that I had, so like the Student Representative Assembly is something that I can easily draw upon. One of, I guess, the largest pieces that people bring year after year is the fact that we don't have like diverse representation, or like the electoral process provides a lot of barriers for different groups to run for these positions. In that sense, I would say like specific examples that I could use is like being a woman on like the governance side is like a very difficult task, because some of the things that you go through is like the experiences that like you have are just very different than the experiences of like your male counterparts on the assembly, and in those circumstances I would say I do have to compromise, I guess, parts of myself, or I can stand by like what I believe, but I would just be perceived differently. So one of the examples that I always like to use is you have like a male colleague on the assembly that can probably speak like 4 to 5 times, and oftentimes a lot of what they say is validated, but as like a female, like you probably spend like 20 to 30 minutes like summarizing your thoughts, like writing it on a piece of paper before you speak like the one time on that assembly, because you want to make sure that your words are like clearer and like you're communicating clearly. I think you also keep in mind like the tone that you're using. Sometimes like passion can be interchanged with like aggression, and that's something that is often placed more, the mannerism often is placed more on people who identify as female than people who identify as male assembly members. I would say like, and then another example, like this is like I think internally to the SRA, but if you look at like elections and as a whole, like some of the biggest barriers that like females like specifically face is at large elections is just like the idea of like having like your face all across campus, right? And having people comment about like your physical identity and that correlation to like leadership. So some of the things that you hear is like, like someone's like rating like female candidates on like how attractive they are and whether that should be a factor in whether they would be a great leader on campus. So when you're looking at, I think, like safe spaces as a whole, I definitely think that they do serve a purpose, and I definitely don't feel like I have to compromise my identity. If anything, I feel like my identity is very well represented in these spaces. But when you're looking at the larger question of like, have we as a campus created safe spaces for people of different identities, meaning do they feel that their identity is like not a barrier in them pursuing different things? I would say we have a lot of work to do in terms of achieving that change. And an example is governance and student representative assemblies, something that I can point out to, or like elections at large as a whole, but that's just one experience. I would say it's an ongoing process to see how we can strive towards creating a larger, safer space.
Perfect. You're answering the last question that I was more asking about, like how do you feel about the safe spaces on campus, and you mentioned how they do serve their purpose and you feel represented in the safe spaces. It will be more like as a MSU as a whole, like that maybe we can do some things to improve. What do you think we can do to improve and help this people with multiple identities to feel represented, not just specific just about women or about race, but more as inclusive in general?
I think like part of it is like the education piece. I really value like so like you yourself have like for example, a marginalized identity or an identity that like is associated as like a minority group on campus. But I think part of it is that you have these spaces where you have other people just like you, but the greater question is like, how are you educating the larger community about some of the languages that they're using that's not inclusive, or some of the things that they're doing that is making it feel like not a safe space for you. And I think the education piece that Diversity Service does a great job in terms of I guess addressing some of the different areas, but I think we as like an institution and as the MSU can take greater steps in terms of like educating the community about the different identities of like the students and the experiences that they have, and supporting them through that process. With respect to specific processes, I think it's always important to keep in mind like the identities that people come from. So I can use one specific to like hiring. So when we do hiring, something that we're recently like moving towards, that we're really striving towards creating those safe spaces is, if you are someone that requires an accommodation, that rather than having to request it like within like the hiring like interviews that are sent out, there is like a line that says, if you are someone that requires like an accommodation, feel free to like reach out, rather than them having to make that assumption and say, hey, I need an accommodation. So I think the proactiveness that you strive in terms of creating spaces, like the MSU has made a lot of efforts and can continue to make a lot of efforts. I think the challenging piece becomes that there's so many different identities, and like how do you cater towards all of that? And that's something that we're still learning to do. As soon as like you have created somewhat of a safe space for one group on campus, there's another group on campus that requires something different. So how you go about creating safe spaces for identities that, like, again, you brought up the term of like intersectionality, identities that are intersectional, right? Like, you can create safe spaces for women, you can create safe spaces for people with like queer identities, you can create safe spaces for students that identify with a disability, whether it's invisible or visible, but how do you create safe spaces for people who have those intersectional identities, who have unique experiences? So I think that's the challenging part of it, but it's also it's also interesting, or because you're always gonna have to strive towards something that is like better, or something that is not where you are today, and that's part of like, I guess, striving towards that social change.
Perfect. Yeah. So those were all the questions. Thank you very much. Do you have any other question that you have to, like, maybe that you can suggest to other safe spaces on campus, or do you think we're doing a great job in this specific one, or that we can incorporate another safe space for a specific identity that you feel that we're not representing on campus?
I wouldn't say it's a particular question. I would say like it's just like more of like a critical like thought. I guess like what I implore like a lot of people to like think about is the idea that like as soon as we like stop doing the work, or we think that we have established a safe space, I think that's when we have truly like failed. Because I think we're always going to strive towards creating a safe space, because like I said, I don't think you'll ever reach like a period or an ending to this, because you're always going to have to continue to put in the work, because there's always going to be something better, or there's something more that you can do. So I do commend, like, I guess, this process of, you know, trying to reach out to people and getting their feedback and trying to see what more we can do. I don't ever see this process ever ending, because I think there's always more that we can do.
Of course. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Now, given all the issues that we have on campus, what do you think we can do to improve and help people feel more represented in this space? Because it can be resident life, or it can be also the MSU as a whole, as McMaster students.
I think it's, especially in terms of employment, it's really hard to always include people, simply because it's easier when everyone sort of fits the shape. Like, it's easier if everyone's sort of the same, so you don't have to deal with like people individually, especially for big organizations like Residence Life. So I think making sure that I think the most important thing always, like I said before, is dialogue. So making sure that dialogue is always open, even though you may not understand someone's reasons for something, especially someone in a position of authority, such as management or whatever it is. Being willing to have that conversation, to understand the other side, because not everyone can just share their stories right away. It's not easy for a lot of people. And so understanding that although you're really vocal about your story, you really want to hear other people's stories, letting other people sort of take their time to open up and be a part of that dialogue, and giving people space, which is another important thing about inclusive space in general, is letting people listen and making sure that you're trying to include them, but also not forcing them to be a part of it.
After interviewing different people in leadership positions on campus, we can have a limited idea of how people feel in different safe spaces. A safe space on campus can go from a lecture and your interactions with professors and your students and how comfortable you feel discussing specific topics, to clubs of specific cultural or interest clubs, and it goes to how you feel as a McMaster student on campus in general, right? The idea of this is to create awareness of how people with multiple identities feel in this different safe spaces on campus, and what can we do in order to improve our safe spaces. We can improve safe spaces by creating different programs that talk about specific issues happening, and also we can create different safe spaces that help people feel represented in them. And this is the purpose of the video. Hopefully you guys like it, and the idea is that we can create more videos like this, talk to people and try to understand what people face every time they're in a specific safe space. And a safe space can be anything on campus that you're part of.